Lesson is from the gospel or from the book of Genesis, portions of chapter 19. When the morning dawned, the angels urged Lot to hurry, saying, "Arise, take your wife and your 2 daughters, lest you be consumed with the punishment of the city." While they lingered, the angels took a hold of his hand and his wife's hands and the hands of his 2 daughters. The Lord was being merciful to him. And they brought him outside and set him outside of the city. And it came to pass, when they were outside the city, the angel said, "Escape with your life, and do not look back, nor stay anywhere on the plain. Escape to the mountains, lest you be destroyed." Lot argued and wanted to go to a small city. "Now see, this city is near enough to flee. It's a little one. Please, let us escape there." "Hurry, escape there," the angel said, "for I cannot do anything until you arrive there." Therefore the name of the city is Zoar. The sun had arisen upon the earth when Lot entered Zoar. The Lord rained brimstone and fire upon Sodom and Gomorrah from out of the Lord from the heavens. He overthrew those 2 cities and all the plain and all the inhabitants of the cities that were around it on the ground. But his wife turned back, and she became a pillar of salt. And the final lesson is from the work Divine Providence, a portion of the number 233. The Lord does not admit people further into the interiors of the things of true wisdom, or at the same time the things of true love, except to the extent that the person can be maintained in them to the end of their lives. Several points are made in this chapter and in this particular section of that chapter concerning this withholding of entering more interiorly into things of heaven than we will be able to be kept in to the end of our life. First, that the interior constituents of a person cannot contain both good and evil along with truth and falsity. They can't at the same time be in a person. They must be separated. "Every kingdom divided against itself is brought to destruction," the Lord said. "Every city or house divided against itself will not stand. Whoever is not with me is against me, and whoever does not gather with me," Jesus said, "scatters." Elsewhere the Lord said, "No one can serve 2 masters at once, for he will either hate the one and love the other, or he'll be loyal to the one and disregard the other. You cannot serve God and mammon." Secondly, it says that the Lord cannot introduce good and truth into a person's interiors except to the extent that evil and falsity have been removed. So Jesus said, "I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him, and I will dine with him, and he with me." The door is opened by the person removing evils, refraining, and turning away from that which is hellish and diabolical. Third point made is that if good and truth are introduced sooner or to a greater extent than evil and falsity have been removed, the first person would turn away from what is good and true. A person's memory, it says, is like the ruminating stomach of certain animals, into which they deposit their food, but that food is not then assimilated into the body, for as long as it is in the ruminating stomach, it is brought back up and chewed, and then swallowed. This is like a person's memory, but their memory is of spiritual things, not material things. To the degree that a person first thinks about, and the person ruminates, those things do not enter fully into the life of the person. But when they have digested them, then it is at first part of the person. Finally, the final point in this number speaks about the love of self, which excels in the talent of affirming what it wills. And it will present a cascade of ideas that confirm what it believes. When a person loves certain things, the kinds of things that they love, they become so blind to other things. Sometimes people will believe things that are so false, ideas that come to them and affirm what they would like to have affirmed. Such ideas are that a human being is simply an animal, and his thinking is like that of an animal. Indeed, that if animals had the power of speech, they would be no different than human beings. The love of self will induce a person to believe that when a person dies after death, they would be just like an animal dying, or that animals after they die will be like human beings, and that animals therefore must have eternal souls. Such irrational ideas and notions come to a person because a love of self wishes to justify whatever gratifies that love. And it inspires fancy. And it's never lacking that more ideas and more falsities can be produced when the love of self rules in the mind of a person. The Lord therefore does not admit a person any further interiorly into the truths and goods of love and wisdom than that person can be maintained in to the end of their life. The Lord brings this about to keep a person from falling into the most serious kinds of profanation. Sacred things that have been described earlier in this chapter. It is because of this danger that the Lord also permits evils of life in many heretical forms of worship. Permitting them, which must be allowed, will be described in the next chapter. Amen. By the work speaking about for the last several weeks, sections from the work Divine Providence. And this Sunday's sermon relates to a chapter that speaks about how the Lord does not allow a person to come more interiorly into goods and true things of the church, of heaven, of His kingdom, of Himself. The Lord does not allow a person to come more interiorly into the Lord, but that the person can be maintained and held in that state to eternity. And this is to prevent profanation. This chapter begins by stating what's being said is really important because it has to do with our salvation. And this must be said, this section about not being interiorly brought into goods and truths, except so far as we can be kept in those goods and truths. These things are said now because the next chapter in the work Divine Providence has to do with permissions. Why the Lord permits so many evils. We could look out into the world and think, yes, there are so many horrible things going on. Well, we can make that observation. It's more important for us to do our spiritual work and look at ourselves and think how the Lord has permitted, has allowed us to enter into evils and falsities of every kind. For no one is perfect. But the Lord permits us to enter those evils and falsities so that we can see them and so that we may shun them and turn towards Him and continue on our spiritual journey. The Lord's desire is to bring us to Him, for there to be a conjunction. And He won't do that if we're going to be becoming closer to Him than we can be kept, lest we take what we did receive and then pervert it. So the developmental stages that we go through are very similar, are represented by the developmental stages of the 5 previous churches, this new church being the 5th. If we can look back at the perversions of each falling or fallen church and think, well, how does that apply to our own life? In the most ancient church, there was a horrible flood, brought an end to that church, an end to that state that is representative of our own state. We can be overwhelmed, flooded by our own evils and falsities. The Lord wants what is of evil and falsity to be flooded, to be removed, to be taken away. And so at the end of the most ancient church, during its close, the church of Noah was being developed. That is, the Lord was being able to implant in the minds of people ideas from heaven which were separate from their ruling love of evil. The Lord allows us to have a separation of the way we think from the way we feel. That separation of the understanding from the will allows us to take things into our memory and know the Lord's Word. So the people of the church Noah were the first to have an ability to comprehend spiritual truths and yet not fully enter into them. By means of the understanding, the will could be reformed. By means of understanding the interior things of heaven, the Lord can let us ruminate, as mentioned in the section from the lesson in Divine Providence. Let us ruminate upon the truth. But that ruminating in our memories, in our understanding, in our rationality, doesn't make it our own. It doesn't make it part of our life. It allows us to see what needs to be shunned as evils against the Lord. You might think the worst profanation took place when the third church, the Hebrew turning into the Jewish church, had the Lord presenting truths right to them and crucified him. That is a representative state that we each have to go through ourselves. And the Lord, as people were following him, gave all kinds of excuses why I can't fully follow you right now. I have to do this or I have to do that. When the Lord was on earth, he said, I have many things to say to you, but you cannot bear them now. There are many things we do in our life which crucify the Lord. Indeed, there are many things that we do that tear down what has already been built up in the remains and the ideas and the feelings that we have towards the Lord and his kingdom. No one leads a perfect spiritual life. And the Lord could not give everything to the people who were listening, his disciples and the first Christians, because they indeed would have entered more interiorly into those things and perverted and ruined them. He gives us what we can have. He holds back that which we would destroy as much as he can, but gives us what we can to make spiritual progress. It wasn't until 1757, the time when the last judgment, the judgment upon the first Christian church, the people who had taken the true things and had twisted and falsified them, that the Lord made his second coming. And allows us now to have deep interior truths. Again, they will only become part of our life insofar as we live them. And all the true things that we have are like the ruminatory stomach of a cow or a deer, chewing their cud. It doesn't become part of their life. Just as when we're chewing things in our own mouth, some nutrients get through the lining of our mouths, but really it's when it comes into the stomach and then is digested that things truly become our own in our body. Same thing spiritually speaking. We have to live the life of heaven in order for the life of heaven to be alive within us. So this chapter is telling us the Lord isn't going to let us come more interiorly into the true things of the church or of the Lord's kingdom or the good things of the life of heaven, except insofar as the Lord can hold us in those things. In this section of Divine Providence, 7 different kinds of profanation are mentioned. Never a pleasant sermon to hear about these things. The Lord gives us the warnings so that we can listen and think and apply the dire things that happen if we don't take the warning. So let's look at those 7 forms of profanation briefly. The first one is taking things from the Word, taking things of heaven, and joking about them. This is the lightest form of profanation. But it still is taking holy things and mixing them up. It's interesting that oftentimes when I tell people that I'm a pastor, that the first thing they want to do is tell me some joke, something that has to do with the literal sense of the word. And oftentimes that's because pastors in the role of preaching to their congregations have more and more come into the entertainment business. Keep your attention focused up here. And oftentimes that becomes then the pastor's show. And joking, our sense of humor, is a great way of entertaining people. This lightest form of profanation is to be avoided, taking ideas, statements made in the literal or things that we know of the spiritual sense and making light of them. And it's very easy. We want to use our rational mind. The first developmental milestone of the rational mind developing is, in fact, a sense of humor developing. Isaac, the first true rational, he's named after laughter. There's something very delightful in being able to juxtaposition ideas and seeing humorous relationships. And the Lord doesn't want us to have a dry spiritual life. The angels have all the joy in the world, but they're not telling jokes based on the things that come from the Word. So we're warned, don't enter into that kind of play with not just things that are from the Word, but things that are about the church. There's a level of contempt. There's a level of contempt that can come into almost any form of humor. And the evil spirits love to feed upon that contempt for the Word by means of using humor to tell stories about the literal sense. There are 5 more forms of profanation. I just don't want to spend the same amount of time on each one. But I think one of the easiest ways to profane is to make light of the things of the church or make light of the things of the Word. A second kind of profanation explained is by those who understand and acknowledge divine truths, nevertheless live contrary to them. And we can all accuse ourselves, as we probably can about joking, with this form of profanation. Of course, we're not living a perfect life every time we know any truth. Do we live according to it in all ways? But when we do find out something is really important and true mentioned in the Word, do we have contempt for that because we don't like it? Our rational mind will find ways to explain away those things that are true from the Lord's Word. And it's taking the sacred and then dismissing it. We're seeing it as less than sacred. A third kind of profanation, it says that those who apply the sense of the letter of the Word to confirm evil and false principles. Anything in our spiritual life can become a point of controversy. The way the world thinks, these things that the world thinks concerning the Word, concerning heaven, concerning the afterlife, concerning marriage, false principles and false ideas become very popularized. Many cultures and countries across the world are more or less atheists. They have been abused by the religious leaders in the past and have rejected so much of what is true from the Word. And so when the sense of the letter is used to confirm evil and falsity, this twists what the Lord has given us. There's great power in the literal sense of the Word, of all 3 testaments, Old Testament, the New Testament, and the writings. The things that are said in, say, conjugal love, concerning marriage. It's easy to say, twist those literal things that are said about marriage and say, well, they're just applying to a period of time when Swedenborg was alive. They don't apply anymore. We have to use our rationality and freedom to see how things do apply that literally were much more prevalent at a certain time than they are today. And yet we can't just dismiss what's literally said in the Word because we don't like it. Cherry picking the parts that we particularly do like and find delightful and saying, well, the rest of the Word was written for a long time ago. We have to find a way to see how every part of the Lord's Word applies to us in some state of our development. Another kind of profanation is said to take place when those people who speak holy and pious things simulate affections for them in tone and gesture, and nevertheless do not believe and love them interiorly. Well, this is a statement really simply about hypocrisy. To put on, to act the role of a true Christian or a new church person. To act that role and yet interiorly deny those things. To fight against that profanation, of course, we must apply the teachings to ourselves. We're not saying we have to go out and show all of our evils and falsities to everyone. But to remember, the Lord's doing His work within us, and not to act as if we're further along on our spiritual journey than we are. Another form of profanation, it says, are those who take divine things and attribute them to ourselves. Do you do that? Do you steal from the Lord? Do you take divine things and claim them as your own? In one sense, that's the whole purpose of spiritual life, is to allow the Lord's divine life to be our own life. But to somehow claim that we have more wisdom than other people because we're in the new church, have the teachings of the Lord's Word. To attribute divine things to ourselves is to steal from the Lord. And the final form being mentioned here in this chapter is those who acknowledge the Word and still deny the divinity of the Lord's human. These forms of profanation apply to all states of the church and all people, but especially we in the new church must look at them and recognize how we can easily deny the Lord's divinity. If we don't fully glorify and allow the Lord to be our Lord and our God in all things, if we have reservations about the statements made in the Word about His divinity, or how He needs to be our Lord over all things in our life, we are in little ways and in bigger ways denying the divinity of the Lord and the power of His Word. And it says, finally, the worst state of profanation is those who acknowledge and believe and live according to the teachings of the Word, and then later on reject them. The Lord can't have good and truth in your spirit that become yours, and then you take those goods and truths, ignore them, and live in evil and falsity and reject that. The Lord can't produce a human being out of that mixture of good and evil, of truth and falsity. We need to separate. The Lord actually does the work. Separate good from evil and truth from falsity. And when we have lived more interiorly in the goods and truths of the church and then reject them, the goods and truths of heaven, and reject them, we're in danger of that worst kind of profanation. Perhaps some of the most fearful, scary things said about people in hell are those who have profaned on this level. It said they appear at a distance like charred bones, without flesh, scarcely having any life. They're not called he or she, but it, because what gives them their identity as a gendered individual has been removed by their mixing together what is good and true with what is false and evil. This is scary. Not a pleasant thing to preach about or think about. And yet the Lord's giving us these true things in the Word so that we can reflect upon them and pray that we may stay on the path that takes us to heaven. It's the Lord's job. It's the Lord's job to see our interior spiritual life and keep us longing and drawing us towards Him. It's our job to respond, to try daily to give ourselves over to the Lord completely. When the little children were brought to the Lord, the disciples thought, the Lord's too important for kids, for infants. And so the Lord said, no, unless we all become as little children, we cannot enter His kingdom. The Lord picked up those babies, put His arms or hands upon them, and blessed them. That's you, and that's me. The Lord is continually drawing and wishing to lift us up and give us innocent states that would receive Him innocently. As we mature and as we learn more and more of the interior things of the Word, we think, well, we've regressed from those interior states and now we're living mature adult lives. We must continually seek to re-enter that state of innocence where we're willing to be picked up by the Lord and taken with Him on our spiritual journey. It looks as if we're walking on our own, but in fact the Lord is drawing us and carrying us at all times. It's said that this section in Divine Providence is especially given because the next section that talks about permissions must be talked about. It must be given to us why the Lord allows such horrible things to take place. And not just to look outside, but especially to look inside ourselves. Why has the Lord not prevented us from certain of our evils and certain of our false ideas? Because He must allow these things to come out in our spiritual life. Have you ever tried to wash a cat? Cats don't tend to like water. Or perhaps if you have a dog, you might have a dog that doesn't like to get washed either. If you've had children, sometimes kids like their baths and sometimes they don't. Sometimes you might get up and go, boy, I really don't want to take a shower or cleanse myself this morning. There are some unpleasant things having to do with being cleansed. But the Lord wants the finished product, and don't you? Don't we all wish to be cleansed? But there's a cat-like attitude within us that wants to just stay away from water. There's something uncomfortable about it. Stay away from being clean. The Lord gives us these teachings not to depress us, not to bring us down, but sometimes to be scrubbed doesn't necessarily feel too comfortable. The Lord gives us these teachings to help our spirit progress, to help us look interiorly at how we can be sure not to profane the things that are of His Word and of His kingdom within us. It can be a harsh scrubbing. Jesus understood that. He couldn't give more to the Christian church as they were trying to follow Him than they could bear. The Lord can't give more to us in any state we're in, more than we can bear. He doesn't want us to collapse at the weight of spiritual truths. He wants to gently lift us up as a parent would lift up a child, as He Himself lifted up children. But we have to have our spiritual dirt removed from us. And sometimes it's almost always an unpleasant experience. We can't get into the kingdom of heaven but by means of temptations and struggles. Reformation, regeneration. It's the Lord's work within us, but we must do our part. So this morning, as you leave church and reflect upon the things that have been said from the Word, go out and this week and reflect upon how you can best serve the Lord, to be on the journey with Him, best follow Him without any reservations. But the Lord wants progress, and He doesn't demand perfection. And we will look back at things that we have done and condemn ourselves where the Lord would forgive us. As the Lord told Lot and his family as they were leaving, don't turn back, don't look back. Those things that are represented by the condemnation of Sodom and Gomorrah, don't go back to them. Don't think back to those things. Think about how the Lord is leading you up to the mountains, leading you up to heaven. Keep an eye on the future and on the Lord's love drawing you. We can't change the past, the mistakes we've made, the evils and falsities that we've thought and lived. We can't change them in ourselves or in other people. But we can keep trying to follow the Lord through our struggles, through our temptations, through our hurts and pains, through our broken relationships, through the promises that we have not kept. But today, with the Lord's help, we can take another step and another step. May the Lord lead you and guide you in all things into His kingdom. Amen.